can't find my baby.
That was the call that launched a massive search for 4-year-old Javeayah Harris.
9 p.m. in Aiken, South Carolina. A frantic mother dials 911. Her 4-year-old daughter is gone, vanished from a backyard chicken coop while she was inside cooking dinner. Search teams flood the property within hours. Dogs, drones, volunteers combing wooded trails in the dark. The FBI joins by morning. Flyers go up with a photo of a little girl in pink Minnie Mouse pajamas, her hair braided with pink beads. The whole community holds its breath, praying for a miracle. But that same night, while search crews were still out looking, something else happened inside that house. Something nobody watching the news had any idea about. Investigators would later discover a detail so disturbing it would unravel the entire case. The child everyone was searching for had already been gone for weeks, not missing, gone. What really happened to her, and why it took a month for anyone to ask where she was, is a story that gets darker with every layer we peel back. Welcome to my channel, where we dig into the cases that deserve to be remembered and told right. If true crime stories like this keep you hooked, hit that like button, drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe so you don't miss what we cover next. Now let's get into what really happened to Javeayah. Javeayah Harris was born into a household already showing signs of strain. Her parents, Michilae and johmarea Harris, were a young couple in their early 20s, raising a small daughter while expecting a second child. On the surface, neighbors along their street described a quiet family that mostly kept to themselves. Nobody outside those walls seemed to know what daily life actually looked like for the 4-year-old inside that home. According to arrest warrants later unsealed by investigators, sometime between the 1st of May and early June, Javeayah suffered a severe injury to her head. Authorities allege the trauma came from physical discipline inflicted by her mother. What should have triggered an immediate call for emergency medical help instead triggered silence. Neither parent sought treatment for their daughter. No hospital visit, no pediatrician, no 911 call. Just a critically injured little girl left without care inside a house where help was steps away. Prosecutors would later describe the parents' conduct in that window using a phrase that carries enormous legal weight: extreme indifference to human life. It's a standard applied in South Carolina when someone's actions, or their failure to act, show such a reckless disregard for another person's safety that it rises to the level of homicide, even without direct intent to kill. In Javeayah's case, investigators allege that standard was met twice over, first through the injury itself, and again through what came after it. Sometime in that same stretch of weeks, Javeayah died. The exact date remains unclear even to investigators, buried somewhere in a timeline her parents controlled entirely on their own. For roughly a month, her absence went unreported. No welfare check, no relative asking to see her, no teacher noticing an empty seat. She simply existed only within the walls of that house, known only to the 2 people responsible for her death. Then came June 30th. That evening, Herring picked up the phone and dialed emergency services. Her voice on the recording is frantic, breathless, exactly what you'd expect from a parent whose child had actually slipped out of view moments earlier.
I can't find my baby. He was outside playing, and I came out here after cooking dinner a little bit, and I'm looking for her, but I don't see her nowhere.
She told the dispatcher her daughter had been playing in the yard near a chicken coop while she finished making dinner. When she stepped back outside to check on her, the little girl was nowhere to be found. She gave physical details: braided hair fastened with pink beads, pajama pants decorated with Minnie Mouse, small pink shoes. She mentioned, almost in passing, that her daughter might have undiagnosed autism, though no formal evaluation had ever confirmed it. Every detail in that call painted a picture of an ordinary summer evening interrupted by an ordinary parent's nightmare. It was convincing enough to mobilize an entire county. Deputies arrived within minutes. By the following morning, the search had ballooned into a multi-agency operation involving the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, State Highway Patrol, and additional local units. Search dogs worked the property. Volunteers combed nearby fields and tree lines. Drones scanned from above. Flyers with Javeayah's photo circulated across the county within hours. her image staring back from telephone poles and gas station windows. Community members quickly began asking why an Amber Alert hadn't been issued. Law enforcement responded publicly, explaining that circumstances didn't meet the criteria required to activate the statewide system, and cautioning that untrained searchers wandering into an active investigation could compromise evidence or even endanger themselves. That explanation didn't sit well with everyone, and frustration simmered even as the search expanded. And there's one more detail from that same night that makes this story even harder to sit with. While deputies and volunteers were fanning out across Aiken County looking for a little girl who wasn't there to be found, Michilae Harris, 39 weeks pregnant at the time of the call, went into labor. She gave birth to another child that very night. A brand new baby entered the world in the exact hours a search party was combing dark fields for the sibling that baby would never meet. For days, the public had no reason to doubt any of it. The narrative held. Search efforts continued through the weekend, fueled by hope and community volunteers determined to bring a missing child home. A vigil was organized. Strangers who had never met Javeayah showed up anyway, lighting candles for a girl they only knew from a flyer. But investigators weren't just relying on hope. Behind the scenes, detectives were piecing together inconsistencies that didn't match the story told on that 911 recording. Threads were beginning to unravel in ways the public wouldn't learn about for several more days. By the time those threads came fully undone, the case would transform from a desperate search for a missing child into something far darker and far harder for this community to comprehend. By July 4th, investigators had spent days quietly working behind the initial narrative, and the gaps were becoming impossible to ignore. Detectives compared statements, timelines, and physical evidence collected from the property, and none of it lined up cleanly with a child who had simply wandered off 4 days earlier. Something about the case felt staged from the beginning, and law enforcement began treating the investigation less like a search and rescue effort and more like a homicide inquiry. On July 5th, that shift became official. Bond hearings were held for both parents, though at that stage, neither had been formally charged with anything related to their daughter's disappearance. Harris and Harris appeared before a judge without legal representation, a decision that stunned courtroom observers, given the seriousness of what was unfolding. Whatever confidence either parent walked in with didn't survive the hearing. Bond was denied for both. Outside the courthouse, the public mood had shifted too. What began as hopeful searching had curdled into suspicion. Social media speculation ran rampant, some of it cruel, some of it eerily close to what investigators were actually uncovering. A community that had spent days praying for a safe return now braced itself for a very different outcome. The following day brought confirmation nobody wanted. According to warrants unsealed that Monday, both parents had confessed, not to losing track of their daughter, not to a tragic accident, to something investigators described using that same chilling legal phrase from earlier: extreme indifference to human life. The confessions detailed how Javeayah had suffered her injury, how neither parent sought help afterward, and how she ultimately died from that neglect weeks before anyone outside their home knew she was gone. Harris was charged with homicide by child abuse and, separately, with filing a false police report, a charge tied directly to that frantic 911 call about a missing girl who, in truth, had already been dead for nearly a month. Harris faced homicide by child abuse as well. Investigators made clear both parents bore responsibility, not just for what happened to their daughter, but for the elaborate deception that followed. With confessions in hand, attention turned to a question that had haunted this case from day one. Where was Javeayah's body? Detectives learned that after her death, Harris told investigators she disposed of her daughter's remains at a location she hadn't previously disclosed to anyone, including the searchers who had spent days combing wooded areas near their own home. That admission redirected the entire investigation outside Aiken County entirely. Search efforts pivoted towards Cedar Creek Reservoir, an expansive body of water known locally for dense clusters of submerged stumps and overgrown shoreline, making navigation difficult even for experienced boat crews. The South Carolina Department of Natural Resources deployed vessels alongside SLED and county fire departments. Unmarked cars lined access roads. Family members of both parents showed up at the scene in tears, desperate for any updates, caught between grief and disbelief that people they knew were now accused of something so unthinkable. Meanwhile, back in Aiken, deputies returned to the family home on July 7th for another round of evidence collection. Investigators spent hours inside the house and surrounding wooded property, though officials declined to specify publicly what, if anything, they recovered. They left the residence after dark, offering no further comment that night. As search crews worked the reservoir, a disturbing detail emerged about how the couple had attempted to erase what happened. According to investigators, corrosive chemicals had been used on Javeayah's remains, a deliberate effort to accelerate decomposition and make identification far more difficult. This wasn't a hurried, panicked disposal. It suggested calculation, an attempt to ensure that even if remains were ever found, there would be little left to confirm who they belonged to. That detail alone transformed public reaction once more. Grief gave way to outrage. A vigil that had once been about hope for a safe return became, instead, a gathering to honor a little girl who never had a chance to be found alive. Neighbors who barely knew the family before this began leaving stuffed animals and candles near the property, a growing memorial for a child most of them had only just learned existed. Throughout it all, one grim reality persisted. Divers and search teams faced brutal conditions in that reservoir. Dense underwater terrain, murky visibility, and the sheer size of the water made recovery painfully slow. Days passed without confirmation, leaving the community suspended between the confessions already on record and the physical proof still hidden somewhere beneath the surface. By the second week of July, Sheriff Marty Sawyer stood before cameras once more, visibly affected by what his department had spent days trying to accomplish.
We've been investigating the death of 4-year-old Javeayah Harris. These updates never get easier to share. This past week has been heart-wrenching for everyone, but we've seen an outpouring of support in Aiken County and a massive joint law enforcement effort.
He confirmed what many had feared but hoped wouldn't be true. Partial remains had been recovered from the reservoir, later confirmed through DNA analysis to belong to Javeayah Harris. It was the confirmation this community had been dreading since the moment those confessions became public. But even in that discovery, the sheriff delivered another sobering truth, one that would define the final chapter of this case and the question of whether justice, or closure, could ever feel complete. Sheriff Marty Sawyer's voice caught as he addressed reporters that day, and it was clear the discovery hadn't come easy for anyone involved in the recovery effort. Weeks of grueling underwater searching had finally yielded something concrete, but the moment carried none of the relief a resolution might normally bring. What officials confirmed instead was a devastating blend of closure and continued anguish. Javeayah had been found, but not whole, and likely never would be. DNA testing matched the recovered remains to the missing child, closing one chapter of uncertainty while opening another. Sawyer explained that due to the chemical treatment applied to conceal her body, along with the punishing conditions of the reservoir itself, additional remains might simply never surface. He called it unlikely that searchers would ever locate everything needed to give this family, or this community, a complete physical accounting of what was lost. For relatives gathered nearby, that admission landed like its own kind of verdict. With identification confirmed, prosecutors moved to expand the charges facing both parents. Beyond homicide by child abuse, Herring and Harris now faced counts related to destruction and desecration of human remains, reflecting not just the death itself, but the calculated effort afterward to erase evidence of it. Legal experts noted that South Carolina treats this kind of post-mortem concealment as a distinct and serious offense, separate from the killing, because it demonstrates intent to obstruct justice and deny a victim's family any chance at proper burial or closure. For Herring, the false police report charge remained attached as well, a reminder that her initial 911 call wasn't simply a lie of omission, but an active fabrication designed to redirect law enforcement resources toward searching for a girl she already knew was gone. Investigators emphasized that this deception cost valuable time and public trust, diverting manpower toward a rescue operation built entirely on false pretense. As formal proceedings moved forward, more about the couple's background came into focus. Records showed the pair had previously lived roughly 90 minutes north in Union County, where court filings listed separate eviction cases against them during 2024 and 2025. Neighbors from that earlier chapter of their lives described a family that mostly stayed out of view, offering little insight into what was happening inside their home. It painted a picture of instability trailing this family long before Javeayah's death, though none of it explained the scale of what ultimately occurred. Back in Aiken, law enforcement returned once more to the family's property, continuing evidence collection even after remains had been identified elsewhere. Officials remained tight-lipped about specifics, citing the ongoing nature of the case, but the repeated visits underscored how methodically investigators were building their prosecution, leaving no detail unexamined before trial. Meanwhile, the memorial outside Javeayah's former home continued growing. What started as scattered candles and stuffed animals had transformed into a sprawling tribute, with strangers from across the state contributing notes, toys, and flowers. Many who visited admitted they'd never known this child existed until her case dominated headlines, yet felt compelled to show up anyway, driven by a collective need to acknowledge a life cut short in circumstances almost too painful to comprehend. Community advocates used the case to push broader conversations about child welfare oversight, questioning what systems, if any, existed to check on families during periods of visible instability like evictions or unexplained absences from school or medical care. Some pointed to the month-long gap between Javeayah's death and her reported disappearance as proof that critical safety nets had failed her long before her parents ever picked up that phone. Legal analysts following the case noted that both Herring and Harris now face the possibility of decades behind bars if convicted on the combined charges. Homicide by child abuse alone carries severe penalties under South Carolina law, and the additional counts tied to concealment and the false report only compound their exposure. Given that both parents confessed according to unsealed warrants, attorneys speculated the case could ultimately proceed toward a plea arrangement rather than a lengthy trial, though nothing had been formally decided as proceedings continued. For a community that watched this story evolve from a frantic missing child alert into something almost incomprehensibly dark, the emotional toll lingered long after cameras left the reservoir. Volunteers who once combed fields hoping to bring a little girl home now grappled with the reality that their search, however well-intentioned, had unfolded weeks after her fate was already sealed. That knowledge sat heavy with many who'd given their time and hope so freely. As for the newborn sibling delivered the same night Herring made that fateful call, authorities confirmed the infant had been removed from parental custody and placed with relatives, a small measure of protection amid a case defined by its absence of protection for the child who came before. Javeayah Harris lived only 4 years, and much of what happened to her may never be fully understood, buried along with evidence her parents worked deliberately to erase. What remains is a warrant full of confessions, a reservoir searched inch by inch, and a community left holding candles for a girl most never had the chance to meet while she was alive. Her case continues moving through the courts, and updates will follow as new developments emerge. If this story affected you the way it affected me, let me know in the comments, and consider subscribing so you don't miss how this unfolds.